The storm had been rolling across the ridge since dawn, turning the forest road into a winding tunnel of white. By the time volunteer responder Whitaker reached the tourist shelter, daylight was already bleeding out, leaving the sky a dull steel color. The cabin stood at the edge of the tree line, half buried in snow, its wooden beams creaking softly in the wind. The place looked abandoned at first glance. No smoke, no movement, no footprints anywhere near the porch. Yet the lock on the door hung open, as if someone had only stepped outside for a moment. Whitaker pushed it gently, calling out, "Shelter crew? Anyone here?" No reply, only the slow groan of old floorboards. Inside, the air was warmer than expected. Too warm. 3 backpacks were lined along the wall, neatly zipped. Jackets hung evenly spaced, like pieces in a museum exhibit. A half-finished board game sat on the table near the window, and beside it, 3 ceramic mugs, each releasing a thin trail of steam into the quiet room. Hot, fresh, as if the owners had just taken a sip moments before he arrived. Whitaker walked deeper inside, scanning the corners. No signs of distress, no overturned chairs, no tracks, no struggle. Just a perfect stillness that felt staged, unnatural, wrong. Then he noticed something that made the hairs rise on his neck. One of the mugs, positioned slightly toward the edge, gave a tiny shift, a gentle, almost curious rotation, like a hand had nudged it and let go. Whitaker froze. The cabin stayed silent. The mug stopped. Outside, the wind howled, but underneath it he thought he heard something else, something soft, rhythmic, steps. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin, leaving no prints on the untouched snow. Whitaker backed away from the window, pulse thudding. Whatever was out there, it wasn't walking the way anything human should. And the warm cups on the table seemed to promise that whoever had been inside hadn't walked out on foot at all.
Whitaker shut the door against the wind. Though it hardly mattered, the sound outside kept slipping through the wood like something alive. The circling footsteps were faint now, almost thoughtful, as if whatever roamed the cabin was studying its new visitor. He forced himself to keep moving. Stillness felt dangerous here. Near the far wall stood a small shelf of supplies, maps, spare batteries, a first aid kit. Nothing unusual. But on the floor beside it, half hidden under a wool blanket, lay a thin, spiral-bound notebook. Someone had dropped it recently. The last pages were bent, the cover still warm to the touch. He opened it carefully. The handwriting shifted from neat to frantic across the entries. Day 1. Snow's heavy, but spirits are good. The ridge looks incredible from the trail. Day 2. Heard something last night. Thought it was wind. Day 3. Lights in the trees. Too high, too slow. Not a drone. Whitaker's breathing slowed. He flipped further. Day 4. Woke up to knocking. No one outside. Tracks stopped 5 feet from the door, like whoever was knocking never stood on the ground. Day 5. They're closer now. They circle the cabin. They don't step. They drift. The last entry was smeared, the pencil dragged as if the writer had lifted their hand mid-sentence. Day 6. One of them looked in the window. It had the rest cut off into a dead line. Whitaker swallowed. He turned instinctively toward the window, the one overlooking the dark tree line. Snow plastered the glass, but he could still make out the shapes of branches swaying. No, not branches. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, tall, narrow, unmoving. its outline blurred at the edges as if the snowflakes passed through it instead of landing on it. Whitaker blinked, and the figure was suddenly gone, leaving only darkness behind the drift. His radio hissed, a low static whisper. For a moment, under the noise, he heard something that wasn't wind, wasn't interference, something that sounded like a voice murmuring his name. The notebook slipped from his fingers. Outside, the footsteps resumed, slow and patient, circling the cabin once more.
The storm thickened as night settled over the ridge, turning the windows into pale, trembling squares of frost. Whitaker moved through the cabin with the notebook clutched in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Every so often he paused, listening, not for the wind, but for the rhythmic gliding sound outside. It hadn't stopped. It just changed direction. Now the steps circled closer. He approached the front window with slow, measured caution. A faint tapping came from somewhere beyond the glass, light, almost polite. He angled the flashlight upward. Snowflakes streaked across the beam. Then something interrupted the light. A shape, tall, pressed close. Whitaker froze as the outline sharpened. It was inches from the window, yet cast no shadow across the frost. Its head tilted, as if studying him. The snow didn't cling to its form, just passed through it, like it was smoke wearing the suggestion of a person. Whitaker stepped back, too quickly, the floor creaking under his boots. The figure didn't move, but another silhouette appeared to its left, then a third. 3 of them hovered at the same distance, their bodies elongated, blurred along the edges the way heat ripples above asphalt in summer. They formed a half circle facing the window, their heads tilting in quiet unison. Whitaker killed his flashlight. The darkness felt safer than being seen. The murmuring static from his radio grew louder, shifting into broken syllables, as if someone were trying and failing to speak through a mouth that didn't exist. He backed toward the center of the room. The wooden walls creaked, not from the storm, but from a slow, deliberate pressure, as though something outside was leaning its weight across the entire cabin. A sudden thud shook the rear wall, then another. Then a dragging, scraping sound that slid upward toward the roof. Whitaker grabbed the emergency lantern and flicked it on. Its warm glow steadied the shadows, just enough to spot something on the floorboards near the back door. Snow, a thin trail of it, curving inward from a gap under the door. That in itself wasn't strange. What was strange were the shapes within the snow. Long, distinct streaks, like fingers, far too many of them, tracing patterns across the wood grain, patterns that hadn't been there moments before. Whitaker knelt, heart hammering, studying the marks. They formed a line leading toward the corner bedroom, the one he hadn't checked yet. The footsteps outside fell silent, and the cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Whitaker stared at the thin snow trail leading toward the small bedroom door at the far end of the cabin. The wind outside had died completely, leaving the night unnervingly still. That silence pressed on his ears like weight. Even the circling footsteps had stopped, almost as if the things outside were waiting. He swallowed hard and moved forward, lantern trembling slightly in his grip. The wooden door stood ajar, only an inch, but wide enough for darkness to leak through the crack like cold breath. He nudged it open. The room was small, barely large enough for 2 beds and a dresser. One of the beds looked slept in, the blanket thrown back in a neat fold. The other was unmade, sheets tangled as if someone had risen too quickly. Then Whitaker noticed something stranger. A pair of boots sat in the center of the rug, perfectly upright, not tossed, Not worn, just placed, like invisible feet still stood inside them. He crouched, studying them closely. Fresh snow dusted the tops, not the floor, just the boots. A faint whisper scraped against the window behind him, too faint to be wind, too deliberate to ignore. Whitaker turned slowly. A face hovered beyond the glass. Not a real face, nothing that solid, more like a suggestion, a human shape with features blurred by constant motion. Its mouth was a dark smear, stretched as if forming a word it couldn't fully shape. Whitaker staggered back, kicking one boot over. It fell on its side, and instead of hitting the floor with a dull thud, it landed softly like it had dropped into thick grass. The board beneath it didn't even creak. The air shifted. The lantern dimmed for half a second. Then came the sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Low, steady breathing, coming from under the unmade bed. Whitaker froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. The breathing grew louder, rougher, as if whoever was under the bed had been hiding there too long. He crouched, forcing himself to lower the lantern toward the floor. At first he saw nothing. Then the rug moved, rising slightly, as though someone had pressed a hand against it from below. Whitaker jerked back, just as the radio on his belt screeched with sudden static. But it wasn't random noise this time. A voice whispered through the crackle, thin, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Don't look at them." Whitaker backed out of the room, slammed the door, and braced his weight against it. The breathing stopped instantly. But outside, the footsteps started again. Slow, closer, circling the cabin once more, only now there were more of them. Many more. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls had inched closer while Whitaker wasn't looking. The footsteps outside had multiplied, soft, dragging glides, circling, slowly, deliberately, like a spinning wheel of shadows. Whitaker backed toward the main room, trying to steady his breathing. The radio was silent again, but the last message still echoed in his mind. Don't look at them. He didn't know who the voice belonged to. He didn't know if it came from a living throat at all. Near the table, something caught his eye. The rug had shifted. Only an inch, but he was sure it hadn't been like that earlier. Whitaker approached cautiously and lifted the edge. A square cut in the floorboards. A hidden hatch. Great, he muttered under his breath, though his voice sounded hollow in the room. 'Cause nothing weird ever happens under floorboards. He slid the hatch open. A cold draft rose from below, carrying a faint metallic smell. He aimed his lantern down into the narrow crawl space. Neatly arranged in the dirt were objects, personal items, each placed with unsettling care. A cluster of keychains, a pair of glasses, a folded knitted hat, a wallet lying open to a smiling photo. Tourist belongings, all of them clean, untouched by dust, preserved, as if someone or something had been collecting them. Whitaker climbed halfway down, boots scraping dirt. The air felt wrong here, heavier, like a pressure was building under the soil. He reached toward a flashlight lying half buried in the corner, its lens cracked. Before his fingers touched it, the lantern flickered violently. Then the footsteps above him stopped. All at once, as if every figure outside, and maybe more inside, had turned to listen. Whitaker froze. The silence pressed so tightly around him, it felt like he'd been sealed inside a tomb. A faint creak came from the floorboards directly overhead. Then another. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing above him in the cabin. Whitaker swallowed hard, heart pounding. Someone or something was inside now, moving slowly across the floor toward the hatch he'd opened. He reached up and pulled himself out of the crawl space, trying not to make a sound. The lantern's light wavered as he eased the hatch closed. The footsteps paused directly on the other side. Whitaker held his breath. The floorboard above the hatch bent inward, just slightly, as though something weightless was standing on it. Then a low whisper seeped through the wood, shaped like speech, but empty of breath. "Not this way." Whitaker stumbled back. A warning? A threat? He couldn't tell. But the thing above the hatch didn't move. It just waited. And outside, the rest of them resumed their patient circling, slow, endless, like they were counting down to something he hadn't understood yet. Whitaker staggered back from the hatch, gripping the lantern so tightly his knuckles hurt. The whisper beneath the floorboards still pulsed in his mind, words shaped like warnings from something that didn't belong to any living throat. Outside, the circling continued, but the rhythm had changed. Slower, heavier, as if the figures were gathering strength or purpose. Whitaker forced himself toward the window, careful not to look directly at the glass. The notebook's warning echoed again. Don't look at them. But curiosity pulled him sideways, just a quick glance, no more. The lantern's glow reached the frost-covered pane, and a face materialized. Human-shaped, but not human. Its features shifted like smoke pushed by invisible hands. For a moment, it resembled a bearded man, wide eyes, weathered cheeks. Then the jaw stretched downward, the mouth elongating unnaturally, melting like wax into a new shape. Another face appeared beside it, a woman's, sharp cheekbones, long hair, eyes too large. She blinked, slowly, deliberately, her irises pale as snowlight. Whitaker stumbled back, his pulse hammered so loudly he barely heard the knock at the door. Yes, a knock. 3 slow taps, measured, human-like. He didn't dare move. A shadow passed across the window, then another. The faces blurred, their outlines wavering, slipping into silhouettes shaped like people he'd seen in the cabin photos. A couple, their child, a young man with a bright red jacket. The missing tourists. They weren't gone. They were here. Or something wearing them was. Whitaker grabbed the nearest thing with weight, the metal poker from the fireplace, and held it out in front of him. His breath fogged the cold air inside the cabin. The temperature had dropped sharply, as if the storm had seeped through the walls. The radio crackled again, louder this time. A voice pushed through, distorted by static. "Don't trust their faces." Whitaker nearly dropped the poker. The voice was familiar. He'd heard it on missing persons recordings from the search station. One of the hikers, one of the vanished. The lantern flickered. Something brushed the outside of the door. 3 gentle drags, like fingertips made of snow, tracing the wood. Then a second knock, closer, more confident. Whitaker stepped back until his spine hit the far wall. The door handle turned, not violently, not forced, just a slow, deliberate twist, as though someone were trying to open it with care, or mimic someone who once knew how. The metal clicked, paused, twisted again. Whitaker lifted the poker higher, breath shallow. Outside, the circling figures stopped in unison, and the door began to open. The door eased open only an inch, but that was enough for Whitaker to see a shape standing in the gap. A silhouette.
broad-shouldered, perfectly still, its head slightly tilted as though trying to decide whether to enter. Snow drifted inside around its feet. But the snow didn't touch its feet. It simply floated through them. Whitaker lifted the fireplace poker, his hand shaking. The thing didn't react. Instead, the silhouette's outline shifted, just slightly, like a candle flame disturbed by breath. Then it spoke. Whitaker felt the sound before he understood it, a vibration in the room, in the wood, in his ribs. The voice was deep, distant, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. "We need help." The words were shaped correctly, but wrong in every possible way, rhythmless, hollow, like someone had heard a human voice once and tried to rebuild it from memory. The door creaked wider. Lantern light washed over the silhouette and revealed a man's features forming on its surface, not growing, forming, as if sketched in charcoal and smudged, then redrawn over and over. Whitaker recognized the shape of the nose, the jawline, the heavy coat. One of the missing hikers. "Evan," Whitaker whispered before he could stop himself. At his voice, the figure brightened, like a predator recognizing prey that finally stepped into view. Its eyes formed last, two pale, washed-out circles that flickered like dying bulbs. The radio, clipped to Whitaker's belt, emitted a violent burst of static. Then a gasp. A woman's voice, broken, desperate. "Don't let it in!" Whitaker slammed the door, throwing his weight against it. Instantly, something pressed from the other side, not hard, not with force, but with persistence, like a hand gliding along the wood, testing for weaknesses. The handle twisted again. Whitaker held on, boots sliding on the floor. The silhouette didn't push, it waited, as if trying to understand how doors worked, how humans resisted. Outside, dozens of shapes gathered. He heard them, not walking, but gliding, brushing against the cabin walls, whispering muffled imitations of voices. Some sounded like children, some like the tourists, some like strangers he'd never met, and one voice sounded eerily like his own. Whitaker's grip faltered for a split second. The door pushed inward, just an inch, and he saw an eye through the gap. Not pale this time, not empty, a perfect copy of his own. It blinked. Whitaker stumbled back, letting the door slam shut. He dropped the poker in panic, chest tightening. The eye, his eye, still hung in his vision even after the gap sealed. The figures outside resumed circling. Slower now, more certain, as if they'd discovered something new about him, something they could use. Whitaker backed away from the door and whispered into the quiet cabin, "What do you want?" Outside, something answered, not in a voice, not in a language, but in a rhythmic tapping on the walls, like tinger fingers tracing his name. The rhythmic tapping on the walls finally stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt intentional, like the figures outside were choosing their moment to breathe again. Whitaker paced the small cabin, every nerve in his body pulled tight. He needed a way out, a vantage point, anything that wasn't four walls closing in under the weight of things that mimicked the living. His eyes landed on a map pinned near the supply shelf. Near the ridgeline, just east of the shelter, a tiny symbol marked an old structure. Firewatch Tower, decommissioned. Whitaker grabbed his coat, lantern, and the half-cracked flashlight he'd found under the floorboards. Staying here wasn't survival. It was waiting to be copied. He cracked the door and peered into the night. The figures stood farther away now, gathered in a loose circle. Their bodies flickered like shadows cast by a candle that didn't exist. They didn't attack. They didn't move. They only watched,
as if curious to see which shape he'd make next. Whitaker slipped outside and closed the door behind him. The snow muffled everything except his heartbeat. He moved carefully, forcing himself not to look back at the circle of shifting silhouettes. The ridge path appeared ahead, a narrow trail winding between frost-bitten pines. He followed it. Halfway up the slope, the forest changed. Branches leaned inward unnaturally, bending under no visible weight. The snow looked untouched, but the air was wrong, too warm in pockets, too cold in others, as if the weather itself was being rearranged. When the tower emerged from the trees, Whitaker almost didn't recognize it. It stood tall, metal skeleton half-rusted, wooden platform crooked. It should have collapsed years ago, but it hadn't, and the snow beneath it seemed undisturbed. He climbed the ladder, each rung screaming under his weight. From the platform he saw the entire ridge, dark, twisting, wrong. The cabins sat below like a black square in a sea of shifting white. The figures had followed him. Dozens now, maybe more. Their bodies stretched taller in the distance, shapes warping like reflections in rippling water. They clustered around the base of the tower, staring upward. The radio on Whitaker's belt crackled violently. A man's voice burst through, raw, panicked, desperate. "If you see the tower, get down. They use it. They—" Then a screech cut him off. Whitaker slammed a hand over the radio, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, rising from the forest itself. The trees shuddered, the ground vibrated. Below, the figures shifted in unison. Then the tower groaned. Metal buckled under an invisible force. One support beam jerked sideways, like a puppet string had been yanked. Whitaker grabbed the railing. The tower swayed. Then again, harder. Whatever the voice tried to warn him about, it was too late. The figures below raised their faces, their eyes glowing faintly, synchronizing their movements like a single, breathing organism. And the tower began to fall. The tower hit the slope with a metallic scream, throwing snow into the air like a white explosion. Whitaker clung to the railing as the structure bounced once, then slid downhill, metal grinding against ice. When it finally stopped, he rolled onto his back, dazed, tasting blood on his lip. The lantern had smashed somewhere along the fall. Only the cracked flashlight still flickered weakly beside him. He grabbed it. The beam trembled across the trees. The figures were no longer scattered. They stood at the edge of the clearing, dozens of them, silent and perfectly still, forming a circle around the fallen tower. Whitaker pushed himself to his feet, breath clouding the air. The circle parted, opening a narrow gap that faced the forest interior. A path, or an invitation. Whitaker didn't take it. He bolted into the opposite direction. Branches slapped against his coat as he ran deeper into the ridge, following no trail, just instinct. The snow muffled his steps, but behind him came that sound again. Gliding, not touching the ground, a soft, wet whispering. He didn't look back. He followed the slope until the trees thinned and something unexpected appeared between them. A clearing, circular, too perfect to be natural. In its center stood a stone mound swallowed by snow, old enough to predate every map he'd ever seen. Something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. His flashlight dimmed as he approached, but he saw the carvings on the stones, lines, spirals, crude shapes of people with no feet, floating above the ground. The same shapes that circled the cabin. A voice broke through the radio again, faint, fading like someone screaming from underwater. "They don't kill you! They wear you!" Static swallowed the rest. Whitaker's breath trembled. He looked around the mound, scanning the carvings, until he found one that made his stomach twist. A human silhouette trapped between two larger shapes, its features erased, replaced with blank space, empty, waiting to be rewritten. Behind him, the gliding footsteps stopped. Whitaker turned slowly. The figures had followed him into the clearing. They formed a half-circle around the mound, their bodies taller now, stretched unnaturally, their faces blurred. But something about them had changed. Their outlines flickered with subtle details he instantly recognized. A patch on a jacket he'd seen on Evan, a scarf from the woman in the cabin photo, a boot tread he'd seen near the shelter door. They were becoming clearer, more defined, more human. One stepped forward, its face stabilized, not a smear now, not shifting, a perfect copy of Evan's face, identical, even the small scar above the eyebrow. Only the eyes were wrong, too wide, too pale, too hungry. Whitaker stumbled back, nearly tripping over a buried root. The Evan thing reached an arm toward him, its fingers stretched too long, soft at the tips, like half-shaped clay. And it spoke in Evan's exact voice. "You don't need your shape anymore." More figures stepped closer, their bodies rippling as they tried on new faces, faces from the photos, from memory, from imagination. Then one of them formed a new face. Whitaker's. Perfect, complete, staring back at him with calm, steady imitation. Whitaker's pulse went cold. The thing wearing his face whispered, "We only need one of you."
Whitaker stumbled backward until the stone mound pressed against his spine. The clearing pulsed with cold, as if every figure around him inhaled at the same moment. The one wearing his face stepped closer. Its movements were smoother now, more natural, like it had practiced being him and was beginning to understand the rhythm of a human body. "Stop!" Whitaker whispered, though he knew the word meant nothing to them. The copy tilted its head, perfectly, just like he did when confused. Behind it, the others shifted shapes, images flickering across their surfaces like memories trying to land. A child's smile, a woman's frightened eyes, the bearded hiker. Then all those faces melted together, pooling into a blank smoothness. Only the Whitaker copy stayed whole. "You shouldn't wear me," Whitaker said, forcing his voice steady. "You don't understand what I am." The copy blinked, the same blink, his blink. "We understand enough," it said. The ground trembled slightly under Whitaker's boots. Snow slid from the stone mound at his back, revealing a deeper carving, one he hadn't noticed before. Two shapes intertwined, one fading, one solidifying. It wasn't a warning, it was a cycle. The figures weren't hunters, they were replacements. Whitaker's flashlight died with a soft pop, plunging the clearing into dim moonlight. The shapes leaned in, their outlines tightening, focusing. The Whitaker copy reached out a hand, fingers stretching, softening, learning every second. "We keep the ridge safe. A familiar shape is needed." Whitaker's breath hitched. His mind raced. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to be him. One steady shape so the others could scatter, wearing what they collected, mimicking travelers, drawing new visitors to the ridge. A lure, a guardian, a prisoner. Whitaker stepped forward, closer to the copy. Its eyes widened with something like recognition or relief. "You can't take my shape," Whitaker said, forcing his voice steady. "I won't let you." The copy leaned in, smiling the same uneven smile Whitaker had since childhood. "We already gave it to us." Then everything shifted. Not the shapes, the world. Trees folded inward like photographs bending in heat. The clearing stretched, shrank, twisted. The mound behind him pulsed once like a heartbeat. Whitaker blinked and found himself standing in the snow, alone. The shapes were gone. The clearing was empty. The forest silent. Only one figure stood at the far edge of the trees, a man in a heavy winter coat. Whitaker's coat. He raised a hand in greeting, Whitaker's exact wave, then turned and began walking toward the ridge trail. Whitaker tried to shout, but no sound came. His voice caught in his throat like a swallowed stone. He touched his face. Cold, smooth, wrong. The snow beneath him didn't crunch because his boots weren't touching the ground. And in the distance, the man wearing his shape walked toward the cabin, toward the radio, toward the world, confident, human, alive. Whitaker tried to run after him, but his legs drifted forward in long, gliding motions. He wasn't running, he was floating. The forest welcomed him with a low, familiar whisper. A new shape had been chosen, and the ridge had a new guardian.